Okay, welcome to our third Brown Bag Lunch event as part of the Vel Phillips Year of Gracious Persistence series at Alverno College. I'm Jody Eastberg, Associate Professor of History and Chair of the History Department here at Alverno College, and I'm also co-chair of this year's events along with Celia Jackson. I want to thank to everyone who's joining us here in the room and also those of you who might be joining us virtually right now or perhaps watching this in the future. We also want to thank the Alverno College Library. This is the first time we're broadcasting from the East Wing of the library, and so it's kind of an exciting moment. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I just wanted to recap for those of you who might not know about the events that we've had this year. So far, we've already had presentations from Dr. Robert Smith of UW-Milwaukee and also James Hall, former president of the Milwaukee chapter of the NAACP. And Dr. Smith provided us with an overview of the national context of the civil rights movement as a way of understanding the significance of the movement, its key concerns, and as a framework for understanding the work of Vel Phillips here in Milwaukee, while James Hall provided us context of issues that have been of particular concern in the city's civil rights history from a legal and organizational perspective, and highlighting the work of the NAACP in issues such as education and fair housing, and also providing some contemporary context for civil rights issues today in Milwaukee. And one thing I noticed each time that we had speakers is that at the end of the talk, when people asked about having more resources, they would inevitably recommend for further research today's speaker, Patrick Jones, and his book on civil rights in Milwaukee. So it's really my pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Jones, to our Brown Bag series from Lincoln, Nebraska. And I'm just going to introduce you, give you a little bit of background on Patrick and why he is an authority on this topic. So Patrick Jones was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. He earned his bachelor's degree in American History, Politics, and Society from Kenyon College in 1993, and his PhD in Modern U.S. History and African American Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2002. Dr. Jones currently resides in Lincoln, Nebraska, where he is Associate Professor of History and Ethnic Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And it's there that he researches, writes, and teaches about civil rights, Black Power era, America in the 1960s, race relations, urban inequality, social movements, electoral politics, African American experiences in the Jazz Age, and post-World War II American popular culture. I'm surprised you don't teach at a liberal arts college. That sounds like the lineup of someone at a smaller
I went to one, and I did used to teach at Allegheny College. So
oh, okay, great. So that's a
very much pro liberal arts.
Excellent. So Dr. Jones is currently editing a collection of essays that explore the relationships of music to the civil rights and Black Power era, as well as he's working on a new monograph that considers the contested meanings of civil rights and Black Power in Cleveland. Dr. Jones published his award-winning book, The Selma of the North Civil Rights Insurgency in Milwaukee in 2009, and Tim Tyson of Duke University, hold your booze, and the Wisconsin fans might be a little nervous about this endorsement, yeah. But he called your book a riveting new story of the civil rights movement in America, a tale on par with Selma, Birmingham, and Montgomery, and its power and importance. And Jean Theo Harris of Brooklyn College said, the Selma of the North provides a devastating rebuttal of many of the conventional narratives of the civil rights movement. So Dr. Jones's book, The Selma of the North, is our focus for our conversation today, and I want to welcome you. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
So, I am going to start us off with a question from one of my students, Nicole, who maybe has, Nicole's right there, okay. Nicole wanted to know, knowing that you're not from Milwaukee, why did you choose Milwaukee as a place to focus a book on the civil rights movement? And to extend that question a little bit, did you know going into this book project that Milwaukee's civil rights history would be such a significant story?
Yeah, well, thank you. And again, thank you for inviting me to talk with you today and participate in the discussion. I appreciate all the work that Jody and others put in to make this happen, and all of you who are students who are engaging my book and this history more deeply and broadly. It's really important, I think, a really important history. And it's importantly connected to ongoing issues that we're continuing to struggle with today in Milwaukee and nationally. So I just really appreciate being here and that y'all are engaging this important history and these issues. Yeah, so how did I get involved in this story and decide to tell it? Well, there's a few different reasons. One is just practical. I got my PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, so I lived in Wisconsin. And ultimately materials and things were available to me, archival materials, people that I could do oral history interviews with, things like that. So there's a pragmatic dynamic. And any of you who want to go on to grad school, I think that's important to consider. There are a lot of good projects, but the doable projects that are doable are the ones that usually get done and done well. So it was a doable project. There were a lot of materials available to me, and it was a story that hadn't been told. And I'll come back to that in a second. The other, I think, probably most important thing, though, was that I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I was born in Baltimore, Maryland, but I grew up from the time I was 2 years old through adulthood when I went to college in Cleveland, Ohio, which is a city that's a lot like Milwaukee and a number of other Great Lakes region, what we might call Rust Belt cities, heavy industry cities that have now been struggling with deindustrialization and trying to reinvent themselves in a post-industrial and post-civil rights era. And so I grew up in a city that had the best and the worst of America's racial story. Cleveland is the city that was the first major American city, large American city, to elect an African-American mayor, and Carl Stokes in the 60s. The poet Langston Hughes, for instance, published his first poems there as a high school student. There's a very long and rich African-American history and tradition and culture in Cleveland, but it's also one of, if not the poorest large cities in the United States. And it suffers from a variety of urban inequalities where race is centrally a factor in that, like Milwaukee, too. So I grew up in a city that had the best and worst of American race relations in it. And I was, for a variety of reasons, drawn to issues of social justice, racial justice. And part of it was that I grew up in a suburban community, but my dad worked in the city. My dad was a vice president of human resources for Blue Cross at the time, and it was the early mid-'70s. And a lot of what his job was to integrate women and people of color into the workforce there. And so my dad did, the kinds of people my parents were, they were pretty liberal-minded people. So there was a lot of people in our life, a lot of different kinds of people in our life growing up. My parents were very open people. They came from a kind of urban, liberal, Catholic background, too. So a lot of the kind of core values that I grew up with are there as well. And when I grew up, though, I grew up in a suburb that was largely middle class and white. My parents were both poor as kids, but they had made it to the middle class. So I grew up in the middle class, and despite what I just said about what my dad did and always having a lot of different people in our lives, the community I grew up in and went to school in as a kid, the public school, was largely white and fairly affluent, middle class. And so as I grew up, I saw the discrepancies in the community, the inequalities in the community, and I began to get involved with some of those issues. The first thing for me was poverty, and in getting involved with poverty, that brought me very quickly to issues of race. And I had a supportive network around me, from my family to my friends to teachers, and importantly, who allowed me to pursue the kinds of questions I was asking as an adolescent coming into my own place in the world and trying very much to figure out why this was the way it was, why there were these gross inequalities that I could see and experience in my community. I could see the urban poverty and the racial aspect of that in the city when I went there with my parents and things, and I could see the affluence and the whiteness of the suburban community that I lived in. So from a fairly young age, I was trying to just figure that out. I grew up kind of naive and idealistic about the kind of ideals that our society claims and things, and then I bumped into reality, and I wanted to figure those things out. I also, from a pretty young age, was politically active. So that translates into my interest in social justice issues, and as I was trying to figure those things out, history kept becoming an important tool to understand why is it that cities, not just Cleveland where I was growing up, but I started to realize this was the pattern in every city in America. And so why is that? Why are these persistent patterns there? How do we make sense of that? And that kept taking me back to history. History also as a discipline allows me to really be interdisciplinary. History has business in it and economics in it. It has politics in it. It has culture in it. It has technology in it. And for me, the important questions are kind of intermix those things. If you want to get into politics, you also have to understand social dynamics and culture and things like that. So as a discipline, history allowed me to ask the kinds of questions that I wanted to ask of the past, questions that were relevant and connected to that present that I was trying to figure out. So for me, history is very much alive, and it's a tool to understand and make sense the world that we're living in. It's a way of knowing and understanding the world and deepening my understanding of why things are the way they are, with the hope that then I can think in a little bit more complex way about where we might go to solve these kinds of persistent problems. So for me, my scholarship and my teaching and my work is inherently political, and that I'm raising what I think are really important and salient and challenging and difficult questions facing our society, in this case, questions about race relations and social change, and how we make meaningful social change that's also sustained or sustainable social change. So I came to it from my own experience initially, and then I ended up at Wisconsin, which had a great program in what I was interested in, modern U.S. history and African American studies, one of the best in the country. And I did my master's on an aspect of the Southern Civil Rights Movement with a great advisor, Tim Tyson. You heard him quoted earlier. They're one of the great scholars of the movement in the United States. And I loved my master's. It was a great project. I did well, but it didn't resonate exactly with who I am and who I was. When I was a grad student, nobody was telling the story of the civil rights struggle and the struggle for racial justice outside of the South. It was told kind of purely as a regional story. And those people outside of the North often kind of looked down their nose, or they would talk about race relations as a regional issue, as a Southern issue. And even if they would acknowledge that there might be some issues in the North along racial lines, they were always kind of minimized or secondary to the Southern narrative. And I knew from growing up in Cleveland, being rooted in Baltimore with my broader family and things, that race was central to the experience of those places too, and that there in fact was a struggle for racial justice in those places, but that we just had not explored it and not looked into it as scholars and as a society, and that it was important for us to do that because the key challenges facing us today in terms of race are often laid on the terrain of urban America. It's the metaphor for our racial tragedy today is not the Jim Crow South, it's the urban North or urban America, and the issues of race and class as they intersect with urbanization and urban issues, and the urban economy and society are really key. So I think this history is particularly important for helping us understand, why is Milwaukee a great city in a lot of ways and a fun place to visit, but atrocious when it comes to racial inequality even today? One of the most, if not the most, segregated city in the country, and we could look across a host of indicators and see a shameful set of statistics about the quality of life for most African Americans and people of color, and in comparison to the rest of the nation. So how can that be? How do we make sense of that? And so I think these movement stories and this history helps us begin to understand, how we got to where we're at, so that again we might think not just about the past and enrich our understanding of the past, but also usable past that can help us in the present too. These things kind of came together, and I thought about working on Cleveland, where I grew up initially, and I had actually started to move in that direction, and that's the project I'm doing right now. Instead, Cleveland's a much bigger city. It's the black community is really a lot bigger too, because it's older and the size is bigger. As a result, there's some complications there in the community dynamics and the social dynamics and politics and things that make the project just a little bit more challenging and just amplified a little bit more. And so I didn't really have a model to work with. As I said, there weren't other scholars doing work in this area on the movement outside of the South. And so a friend actually had done a little bit of work on the open housing campaign and presented a little piece of that, found a couple of resources and things in a class I was in. And I didn't know the story of the open housing campaign and Father Grappi and the Youth Council and the Commandos. And I began to learn a little bit more about it, poke around and look into some of the sources. And I couldn't believe how dramatic and important the story was just from an initial glance. and I couldn't believe that nobody had really done the project before. That was stunning to me, given the level of protest, given the shocking level of white reaction, given the national significance and notoriety that Milwaukee got during that period, given the unique and interesting dynamics of this white Catholic priest and Father Grappi being a kind of public figurehead for what is really a Black Power movement later, that kind of thing. So I began to get interested in that. I was there, living there, and as I said, all these resources were available. Milwaukee was a little smaller, the community's not as big, the Black community's not as big, and as I said, for a first project where I was kind of testing out a lot of my ideas about the Northern movement, and trying to show people and prove to people there is a there. There's a history that we're forgetting and we're overlooking, and that's important, and what that history might look like, similarly and different from the Southern movement. So I could wrap my hands around it, I could get access to resources and people to do oral histories, and I could minimize the risk in a certain way because of that easier ability to kind of wrap my arms around the story and the city in those ways. But it's very personal. There's no doubt about it. I was raised Catholic too, and so the dynamic about the Catholic Church and Father Grappi, this white guy who's involved with struggles for racial justice, there's a resonance to me in some of those things, in my own just personal struggles and existential issues in that regard too. And I think most of us seek work and gravitate towards topics and subjects that in some way touch us and resonate with us and who we are or what we're interested in and what we, how we orient ourselves in the world. And so there were a lot of things in this story that spoke to me and stood out to me, and I just felt I needed to tell it and do the work.
That's great. That's a really nice segue to a next question I have, which is Alverno College and its alums like Peggy Rosga had a role in this history. So can you speak to what the role of college students was in the civil rights movement and also the Catholic Church in Milwaukee civil rights history?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think Milwaukee, like the 60s narrative generally and the civil rights struggle particularly, young people, I'll say it like that instead of students right now, young people are central to the story. They're really, by the mid-1960s, the vanguard of many of the local campaigns for racial change, and it's those local campaigns that then are the engine for the national change that happens. Just like in Milwaukee, the local open housing campaign is a catalytic local campaign that helps gain passage of the national Fair Housing Act, and young people are central to it. If you look at my book, or you just look at this history, look at the resources, read the newspapers, you'll see young people involved throughout, most clearly in the Youth Council and the Commandos. They were the leading edge. They were pushing the community in new ways, and sometimes challenging ways, in ways that a lot of their elders, whether it was parents or other ministers or teachers or civic leaders, didn't necessarily feel comfortable with all the time and didn't necessarily support right away. But as is the case in many places, young people stepped out, and once they started to step out and then face the consequences of challenging white supremacy, so getting arrested, getting beaten and things like that, that made hesitant parents and ministers and other civic leaders who might have been on the fence or might have been, for a variety of reasons, not particularly fond of protest politics and civil disobedience, it made them get on board. That draws a pretty sharp line when your kids start to get arrested and national attention, and so others then pour into it. So they're really this leading edge, a catalytic edge and a transformative edge of the movement, and that's true of Milwaukee, and it's also a national theme in civil rights history too. College students are certainly a part of it. Peggy is a great example of it, and somebody that I hope that y'all are incredibly proud of, and there were other students there that were involved in almost every college around the city had at least an organization that was interested in whether or not explicitly civil rights issues. It might have been a religious group or a community-oriented group or a group focused on city kinds of issues or something like that, or maybe poverty or what have you. But by the 1960s, race was infused with all of those things. So if you were a campus ministry kind of group, if you were real and relevant and focused on the society you were living in, and as young people, you were embracing your world and this was going to be the world that was yours, you had to grapple with race, and all those groups had to start confronting race. It was the issue of the time. And so many students get involved. Now, it's not a majority of students at any given place, just like it's not a majority of people at any time in the 60s that are involved in protest politics and marches and demonstrations and things. There are a lot of students who are watching, who maybe even support what's going on but are not participating in it. But you do get, at each of the campuses around the city, groups of students who are moved to participate, and through their participation then get more deeply involved, go through a experience, what Father Grappi called a conversion experience, and engaging in the struggle for social justice from a resonant spiritual place, or from a resonant youthful place where you think this is the world that is mine and I'm going to inherit it, and I want it to be the best world, and I want it to be an egalitarian world, and I want it to live up to the ideals I've been told, right? These are powerful places people are coming from, and once you engage the system and you see it push back, you see the ugliness of these systems of power and defending themselves, people are getting beaten and arrested, when you begin to really see the struggle of other people that are not like you, perhaps. Peggy talks a lot about that, being moved by what she saw around the city, but also when she went south and seeing the reality of the Jim Crow South, or when students that they had met in the South came up to Milwaukee to visit afterwards and could only kind of visit in the inner core area of town, and that made Peggy and others think hard about the kind of what I would call the architecture of race, the ways that race and class are stamped in the physical geography, and it had kind of opened her eyes to it, right? So she's going through a process as she's engaging more and more these issues intellectually, but then physically by participating. And so a lot of these young people, a lot of students have that kind of process, and they're invaded with the spirit and the energy and the hopeful idealism and the determination and the arrogance and the chutzpah and the awesomeness of youngness too. And that energy is really important to the movement. So all of these places have young people involved. As for the Catholic Church, that's a fascinating dynamic of this story, and there's a great book yet to be written about the 60s era and the Catholic Church and activism, and because the church is going through some change itself, both globally. This is going to be the time of Vatican II and the reform efforts that come then, when the church is going to liberalize in a lot of ways, and democratize in a lot of ways, but also in a very new way commit itself to engaging the world and engaging with the salient and most important issues as Christians, and that meant social justice issues. Catholic social teaching is clear on labor issues and race issues and immigration and things like that. So it's a time where Catholics are in great debate with each other about the church and its future, and there's a reform spirit in the church. This is going to divide the church in a lot of ways, though, between traditionalists and Orthodox kinds of Catholics, those who are going to be beholden to the way things have been, and those who are going to embrace reform and newness and change. The Catholic Church is also divided by race and class, so the Catholic Church really grows up strongly the late 19th into the 20th century with these new European immigrants that come, and they live in ethnic enclaves and different ethnic communities in the city, and there's often a Catholic Church at the heart of that community and things. But by the time period we're talking about, a certain number of folks that are white, their parents or their grandparents were immigrant, white ethnic immigrants, they've made it to the middle class. Maybe it's through a union job in industry, or maybe it's through getting education and being able to get a professional degree and being a lawyer or something. But a certain number are now able to reach the middle class, and they begin to move to the suburbs, and they leave those folks who can't behind. And so white ethnic communities are increasingly struggling. The Catholic Church begins to open up new churches out in those suburbs, but interestingly for the Catholic Church, unlike Protestant churches and Jewish synagogues, they try not to close down churches. They'll keep the old ones, and then they'll open a new one out in the suburbs or what have you. Terrain and turf is important. So on the one hand, the church is transforming as white affluent folks are moving to the suburbs, and the church needs to cater to that and build new churches and create new schools, and that's a source of great revenue because those are affluent white people and things like that, right? They need to cater to the traditional white ethnic Catholic communities that are still in cities, but they're struggling those people with means have largely left. So you have an increasingly imperiled white ethnic communities in traditional neighborhoods. They're struggling, property values might be in decline, the infrastructure in the city overall is in decline, there's great anxiety, automation's starting to creep in, so they're worried about their jobs, things like that. New weird people are moving in from, white folks from rural areas in Appalachia to African Americans and Latinos, and things that feel threatening to a lot of those white ethnic Catholics. So the church is trying to straddle class divisions among white communities, but then you get this growing African American community that's ghettoized, right? It's segregated in the north part of the city. And there are about 5 Catholic churches that used to serve, German community, for instance. But the white folks have largely moved out, and that community has now found itself populated overwhelmingly by people of color. So if you're a white Catholic priest or nun in one of those 5 parishes, St. Boniface is one of them, where Father Grappi was, to be relevant as a white Catholic priest and nun, you need to understand the community that lives around you. You need to speak to their experience. You need to advocate for them. And that's what happens in those 5 churches in Milwaukee, and that's a pattern that happens across the country. Those folks begin to engage the communities of color around them, and in doing that, they begin to see the conditions and the circumstances that people of color live under in America. They begin to see the racism and the challenges that are different than even white ethnic, poor and working class white ethnic folks face in the society. And that, again, is transformative. And those priests and nuns become more and more deeply committed to racial justice because they're moved by the Spirit. They will often say, this is the manifestation of God and Jesus and this new spirit in the church in our society. If we're going to be engaged, and we're going to be engaged with the lowliest, as Jesus says, well, what that means in this moment is the civil rights struggle. Right? What that means is to go into the streets with these people and advocate for basic human rights and dignity and justice. Now that's countered, though, by traditionalists who are afraid of that, who see people of color as a threat to their well-being, who are used to going to a priest when they have troubles and that priest advocating for their interests. So Father Grappi grows up on that south side of Milwaukee, where, near where you guys are at, and in a working class part of town. And he understands that world, but he ends up living on the north side among African Americans and committing himself 110% to the struggle for racial justice. And that's hard for a lot of white working class Catholics to make sense of. He's not only a race traitor, a white man in the struggle for racial justice, but he's a religious traitor in a way too. He's a white Catholic priest who's advocating for African Americans and not in the interest, they would say, of those white working class folks that he was one of and grew up as one of as well. And so you can see it's fraught. The church is fraught with these kind of class and racial tensions. It's in a transformative place. And so much of this story plays out through the politics of the Catholic Church. Milwaukee is almost half Catholic, and because of the way the church is set up and the emphasis on rules and regulations and hierarchy and deference to authority and that kind of stuff, that makes the church the primary way that most Catholics understand the world, view the world. It makes it the primary institution that people turn to first and foremost to represent their interests. And so, one of the interesting things is that the bishop has to navigate this. So on the one hand, he doesn't want to, at this time, alienate the white working class who literally, as many priests and nuns told me when I was doing research, pay the bills for the church, right? So they don't want to upset them too much, but at the same time, out of conscience and spirituality and the teachings of the church, really, he wants to let priests and nuns like Father Grappi or Pat Flood or others who are in those inner city churches, or lay people who are moved by the Spirit to be involved with struggles for justice, to be involved, to allow them to follow their conscience. And there's a fine line and a tough line that the church hierarchy has to toe there institutionally between these contending forces. Meanwhile, a lot of white suburbanites will support civil rights publicly, but they don't really have to bear the burden of the racial change. not a lot of people of color, because of dollars, are going to be buying hundreds of thousands of dollar houses in the affluent suburbs around the city, so that's not going to be much of an issue, even if they pass an open housing law. Busing oftentimes doesn't extend into the more affluent suburban areas and things like that. So there's a lot of politics here about race and class that are playing out in the church, but it's a fascinating and important one. We're going to end up with the same thing in the Catholic Church that happens in all of the mainline Protestant churches and Jewish communities, which is coming out of the 60s with a bifurcation, two different views. Reformists, progressive, liberals, whatever you want to call them in the denomination, who kind of embrace change, embrace reform and things like that, embrace civil rights and things along those lines, changing roles of women and gender. And then those who are not supportive of change, whether it's race or gender or others, and embrace and hold on tightly to tradition and orthodoxy. And so, later we'll call these the culture wars, but we'll see that kind of split between kind of liberal and traditionalists within the Catholic Church, and that happens in other denominations as well. But it's a really fascinating history here, the church dynamic. And I would just note, one of the things is that when reaction comes, white reaction comes, those guys don't march to the mayor's office, they march to the chancery to try to pressure the archbishop to stop Grappi from doing what he's doing, right? It's a Catholic thing going on there largely. It's white Catholic people arguing with each other there. And so I think that tells us something about the importance of the church and how that's playing out there.
That's great. I'm aware that probably there are some questions from the audience that people might want to ask. Does anyone? I have more, but does anybody want to step in with a question? Okay, I'll keep going, but now's your time to think of that. They'll all flood in right at the end. So I'd like to hear a little bit from you about Vel Phillips. This is our year considering her role in our city, and I'm wondering what her significance is, and if you can tell us about what you've taken from her, both as a scholar, but also, part of your personal story seems to be connected, and you had some time to interview Vel, I'm sure. So maybe just your perspective on Vel, who we're honoring.
Sure. Oh, I could talk to you all day about Mrs. Phillips. I love Mrs. Phillips very much, and I say that from the heart. I had the great fortune of doing this work, this scholarship. I mean that. I'm just the person who's fortunate to done the work at the archives, talk to the people, and hopefully do a good job putting it together and communicating about it and drawing out some lessons for folks. And one of the great things about my job is that I get to meet people and do oral histories, and I get to know a lot of them. And I've come to know many, many great people that are involved with the civil rights movement across the country. And through this project, I met so many wonderful people in Milwaukee that were involved in this history, a history that's important not just locally but nationally, I'd say too. And no one has a deeper place in my heart of anybody I've ever met, not just in Milwaukee but across the country, than Mrs. Phillips. I lived near her when I moved to Milwaukee to do my work and my research, and I did many, many oral histories with her. I was just a couple blocks from her, so I'd go get her, and we would get together on the east side there and go to a coffee shop, and we would just talk. And we had all the time in the world, so I'd turn on the recorder, and we would just start talking. And we're both talkers. Immediately, our personalities hit it off. We're both pretty outgoing people and smile a lot and that kind of thing. And I think we connected. Mrs. Phillips was at a point in her life, her husband had passed away, and she was still very active, but there's a loneliness in her life after her husband died. And I think the combination of her lived experience and then the deep research I had done in this history, so when we talked, I knew I wasn't a part of it. I didn't live it, and I'm white, a white guy, but I knew what she was talking about from a different angle, and I knew it deeply. And she liked that, and I liked it, hearing her firsthand account, of course, and I needed it for what I was doing. But I think those things fit together really nicely, her experience and my scholarly understanding of what was going on, and we just, and our personalities, so we just really enjoy each other. And so we became deep friends, and I came to admire her greatly as a human being. Mrs. Phillips her energy is just boundless, and her goodness she's just going all over the place. And many of the people that I know who lived long lives, I think it's because they continue to be actively engaged in their life throughout, and that's certainly Mrs. Phillips, challenging herself and others consistently in the name of equality and justice, and particularly in terms of race and gender equality, but in a host of other areas too. And it's an exemplary life, one of deep and great impact in the state of Wisconsin, but also nationally. And we could tick off all of those achievements, and I can do that if you want me to, but I'll just say more deeply about the open housing thing. I think what's really interesting and important and fascinating is that Mrs. Phillips comes from a particular generation of black pioneers. She grew up in the black middle class, really, and had some opportunity from her circumstance, but also that she made by her hard work in school and scholarships she got and things. And she went to Howard, and that expanded her terrain. But her family circled in the black middle class, and she's a lawyer coming out of school, and she breaks a number of barriers. But that class, nationally, but also locally, was often more conservative, and that's true in Milwaukee, where many of the other black professional class, particularly the generation that lagged hers one notch, they weren't psyched about nonviolent direct action and protest politics. Many of the NAACP activists preferred, the slow, steady march through established institutions, particularly the courts. And they were uneasy with protest politics. And as black middle class, many times they were connected to the white power structure, either economically or politically, etc. And they had something different to lose as well. They also had something to argue could be gained by a negotiated kind of strategy and a cooperative strategy between whites and blacks too. But as the energy in the era increased and protest politics engulfed formal politics, and young people began to take the lead as a more militant vanguard all across the country and in Milwaukee, it would have been easy for Mrs. Phillips to, when Father Grappi and the Youth Council and Commandos came to her and said, "We'd like to march, we'd like to help you," for her to stay ensconced in her secure middle class and professional place and to say, "You could do it, whatever you're going to do," but not participate. She could have. Many people would have supported her in not participating in marches and demonstrations, and she makes a different choice. In part because of her experience, she's so frustrated by the mid-late 60s because she's been introducing this piece of legislation time and time again. It's getting voted down every time, 18-1. She's frustrated, and she sees the desperate need for change. So she agrees for them to help by engaging in direct action. She doesn't participate the first night of demonstrations, but she sees the beatings that they take, and she feels, because she's a good person, right? She's got a deep conscience, and she's a mom. She has 2 kids. She's a soulful person, a nurturing person. She feels responsibility for these people, for these young people who are marching for her bill, right? And so she feels that she has to go and march, that out of just kind of her own integrity, her mother, who's the central figure in her life, and her husband, the other central figure and influence in her life, both counsel her and say, this is maybe not the best idea, and maybe don't do it. They're ultimately going to have a bullet shot through their window and lodge in their oven door. And at any of these points, she could have walked away, and she doesn't. And so I think that's really interesting about her, this kind of fusion of middle-class politics and a politic of respectability that she embraces and often articulates in her life and her formal political activism, but also her willingness, particularly at that moment in the late 60s during the open housing campaign, to come down from that formal power and that class privilege within the black community and to participate and to march in the streets and to put herself at risk. It's also to use her symbol. She also has a powerful symbol as a woman and as a city council member to go down and march. There's some, really good, something good can come of that politically. But there's risk involved too, and there could have been an easy out. So I think that's something that's really remarkable, and it's important about her, as well as her longevity and all of the pioneering firsts and her continuing to work up until this day for issues. I'm also just reminded that we became really good friends. I went along. I took her. She doesn't drive, so I was kind of her driver. It was like driving Miss Phillips around, and we would go to things from informal things to events to meetings and have a good old time. And wherever we went on an event, there were a lot of people like you all there, college students and high school students that were always at these events. and particularly young women were drawn, and still today are. There's always a circle of young women, particularly women of color, but not just women of color, who I always noticed would be just so drawn to Mrs. Phillips and around her all the time and want to talk to her and just feel it really intensely from her and be so proud and inspired by her. And Mrs. Phillips, you have to know, she's like loving and warm, but she also tells you, like, girl, why are you wearing that and let your belly hang out or something like that? Or she'll say to you, like, she'll correct your grammar or something. You know, so she's stern on you too, in a motherly kind of way, but in that kind of middle-class propriety way. And young people just kind of thrilled to the whole thing of Vel, her personality, her achievement, her continuing commitment, the model that she presented as a woman, her like huge personality and the way she laughs a lot, the lovingness within her, but also the way that she could tut you and correct you, and in a way that you didn't feel like defensive and alienated about, but you felt, you know, inspired to be better, and to have excellence be your goal and things. So I think that's something that's really wonderful, and that always impressed me in a modern context when I was going around with her in the 90s and early 2000s in Milwaukee and going to a lot of events, was that constant group of young people that were just energized by her and inspired by her and that model that she provided. And that always spoke powerfully to me too. And if you are inspired by her, you should take the opportunity to get yourself in front of her. She'll meet you, she'll talk to you, she's very approachable and very accessible and very wonderful, you know, too. She's struggling, and she's older now, and she's struggling with health, and but as of, she's always there for young people too, and that's, I think, a really wonderful part of her legacy.
Thank you for that. How many of you have read in the audience a part of or all of Dr. Jones's work? So we have quite a few people here who have done a little bit of reading. Do you have questions for him? Yeah, Celia?
Can I speak from here?
Yeah, you can just speak from your seats, hopefully.
Okay. So first of all, I just want to thank you and acknowledge you for your authenticity. It just really comes across very genuine, and so I really appreciate that. And I'm one of those black folks that's Catholic that grew up. I'm not originally from Milwaukee, but I lived in Cleveland. And I also, as a kid, spent a lot of summers there, and I also went to high school in Milwaukee. So there was really a lot of what you said that is part of my own lived experience. So I just needed to say that. But I guess I was really curious, in any of the conversations that you had when you were doing research, your connection with the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. I believe the Archbishop probably would have been Rembert Weekland during that time, and I believe Cousins was probably the Archbishop at the time that the fair housing was going along. And if you could really comment on any of the communications you had with the diocese, because there are some really interesting aspects on how the diocese chose to deal with blacks and black Catholics in particular in Milwaukee, and whether any of that came out in the course of your interview.
Yeah, well, my experience as first a grad student, and then turning my dissertation into a book and kind of tidying up some research stuff after I finished my PhD at Wisconsin. A lot of the contemporary hierarchy I dealt with more just to get access to materials, and that kind of bureaucratic function as a scholar doing this history. I was treated well and warmly by the current, the contemporary Catholic Church, and helping me gain access to resources and navigate that kind of stuff and talk to me. So yeah, one of the challenges, for instance, Cousins is the bishop at the time, Archbishop. His papers, though, were closed for 25 years, I think it was. I'm going from memory here. I think it was 25 years after his death. And so I couldn't get access to his papers, which I would have loved to, and that we should be coming up on that date, that year, if we haven't already. And there's somebody out there who should do a great project on that, looking at his papers and what that adds to all of this, and by getting behind the curtain a little bit more on that. So I could get access to what I could get access to. One of the realities is that there are some broad archdiocese kinds of records you can get at, but each individual church kind of maintains its own stuff, and most haven't done that. And I would call individual churches that were involved and say, hey, do you have materials? And they say, I don't know, maybe we have some stuff in the basement, or in the, I don't know, or Mrs. Johnson is kind of heads that up, but she's not really an archivist. She's just somebody at the church, and nothing's really. So most churches either don't have an archive or have stuff, but it's never been organized, and so it was hard to get access to a lot of Catholic materials. And one of the lessons for me that maybe the church or individual parishes that have a rich history on a particular issue is to form a committee or to put some resources towards greater organization of these records and things, which are really valuable and important, because the church is so important and it's so big and diverse. And that's, I think, the other thing, which is that depending on who I talked to and depending on what part of the city I was at, depending on what age they were, depending on what their race and class was, Catholic people talked in very different ways about race. Obviously, the small number of African American Catholics had a lot to say, both as proud Catholics and being a part of the institution and things like that, but also about some of the challenges that they faced institutionally, whether it was within schools and education or within the power structure, and getting support for particular issues and things that they might care about or might be relevant in the communities that they lived in. Others, when I would ride around on the bus going to archives, depending on what part of the community, people would either they'd ultimately hear what I had to say and what I was doing, and Father Grappi would come up, and people would either revere him and go off about how he was inspirational and he's what they want the church to be now and what it should have been then, or revile him and hated him and say he was divisive and that's not what the role of a priest should be. And this is in 30 years plus 40 years later still going on. So it's clear to me that those politics are still raw, and a figure like Father Grappi still animates a lot of tension within the church around issues of class and race and the role of the church in society and whose church it really is. I think there's a lot of issue about Black Catholics and authenticity and legitimacy, because they're not seen as, most African Americans aren't Catholic. So if you're a Black Catholic, you came to the church in some way or something. You're not legit in some way, so there was a lot of authenticity and legitimacy kinds of things that were going on with that too. But and there are a lot of issues around education, schools and education, particularly at those 5 parishes that were in the African American community, because a lot of parents would send them to those churches because they were desperate for schooling.
Patrick, I just want to, sorry to interrupt you for a second. Sure. I want to take the opportunity. We have a very, rigid schedule, which I'm sure that you can start seeing people have class that they need to go to. So, one, I want to thank you. Stay on. We're not going to end our conversation, but I want to thank you before some people might need to leave to change. So, can we give Patrick a round of applause? Thank you. And
students, if you want to, if I can help you, if you're interested in this further, feel free to look my email up at the University of Nebraska. I'm in the history department and the ethnic studies program, and I'm happy to communicate with you further if you're interested.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to officially end the broadcast, but please stay on the line and we can have more conversation, just not recorded. So thank you, Patrick.